I am Lawrence, 66 years old, and my idea of family loyalty was just shattered in an airport terminal. I paid $25,000 to send my son, his new wife, and their blended family on a 2-week Hawaiian vacation. Instead of a thank you, I received a call from airport security. My 8-year-old grandson, my son's child from his late first wife, had been abandoned at the TSA checkpoint. His stepmother boarded the plane with her own children, and my son leaving him behind like forgotten luggage. Later, she sent me a text saying she decided he was grounded and would stay at home. I did not scream. I did not call them to argue. I simply went to my home office, opened my financial ledgers, and within 3 days, their paradise was reduced to ashes. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that anyone who abandons a child deserves everything coming to them. My lungs burned as I sprinted through the sprawling expanse of O'Hare Airport Terminal 3. The harsh fluorescent lights blurred overhead, casting long, frantic shadows against the polished linoleum. I ignored the irritated grumbles of passengers as I shoved past rolling suitcases and lingering crowds. My focus narrowed to a singular, terrifying objective. The phone call from airport security 20 minutes prior had stripped decades from my age, injecting my veins with pure adrenaline. I reached the glass doors of the security office and pushed my way inside, my chest heaving. And there he was. Leo sat on a rigid plastic chair in the corner of the sterile room. He looked so incredibly small, his thin arms wrapped tightly around a faded Batman backpack as if it were a shield against the world. His face was pale, his cheeks stained with dried tears, and his legs dangled inches above the floor, kicking nervously in the heavy silence. Officer Briggs, a burly man with a tired expression, stood near the desk, holding a clipboard. He looked up as I approached, assessing my panic. He confirmed the nightmare. They found Leo wandering alone near the TSA checkpoint, clutching his boarding pass. The boy had been crying, searching the sea of strangers for a father who had already walked away. The reality of the situation hit me like a physical blow. Just 4 weeks ago, I had signed a check for $25,000. I handed it to my son Cameron specifically to fund a massive blended family bonding trip to Maui. It was supposed to be a fresh start. Cameron's new wife Vanessa had 2 children of her own, and the dynamic in their household had always been strained. The vacation was my attempt to bridge that gap, to buy them the time and space to finally integrate Leo into their new life. Instead, they had used my money to fly across the Pacific, leaving my grandson stranded in one of the busiest transport hubs on the planet. I knelt in front of Leo. He looked up at me, his lower lip trembling, and threw his arms around my neck. He buried his face in my shoulder, his small body shaking with silent sobs. I held him tight, offering quiet words of comfort to the boy, but inside a profound, unyielding coldness began to take root. The panic was evaporating swiftly, replaced by a crystalline, absolute clarity. I thanked Officer Briggs, signed the necessary release forms, and took Leo's hand. We walked out of the terminal together, leaving the chaos of the airport behind. We reached the concrete silence of the parking garage. The heavy thud of the SUV door echoed loudly as I helped Leo climb into the back seat, making sure his seatbelt was secure. I closed the door, leaning against the cold metal of the car for a fraction of a second to catch my breath. Then my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen illuminated the dim garage with a new text message. It was from Vanessa. I opened it, my eyes scanning the harsh digital letters. Leo threw a tantrum at check-in. I've decided he's grounded and will stay at home. We left him at security for you to pick up. Don't ruin our trip by calling Cameron. He agrees with me. I read the words 3 times. There was no apology. There was no trace of concern for an 8-year-old child left to wander among thousands of strangers. There was only the suffocating arrogance of a woman who believed she held all the cards, and the devastating confirmation of my own son's cowardice. Cameron agreed with her. He had walked through that security scanner, handed over his ticket, and boarded a commercial airliner, leaving his firstborn son behind to appease his new wife. I did not scream. I did not hurl my phone against the concrete wall of the garage. I did not dial their number to unleash the fury boiling in my chest. To engage in a screaming match with them while they sat in first class drinking champagne on my dime would be a useless expenditure of energy. I simply switched my phone to silent and slid it back into my pocket. I climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. I looked in the rearview mirror. Leo was staring out the window, his small hands gripping the straps of his backpack. He asked me in a voice so quiet it barely reached the front seat if his dad was mad at him. I looked at my grandson pushing down the bile rising in my throat and told him that his father was just confused, but that he was safe now, and that was all that mattered. The drive back to my estate was cloaked in silence. When we arrived, I focused entirely on repairing the immediate damage inflicted upon the boy. I made him his favorite meal, set him up in the living room with a blanket and a movie, and sat with him until the tension finally drained from his small shoulders. Once his breathing slowed and his eyes grew heavy with sleep, I quietly stood up and walked down the hall to my home office. I closed the heavy mahogany doors, sealing myself inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the city lights bleeding through the blinds. I turned on my desk lamp, walked over to the steel safe bolted into the corner of the room, and spun the dial. I pulled out 3 thick leather-bound ledgers. For years, I had maintained a quiet distance from Cameron and Vanessa's daily affairs, observing their lavish lifestyle with a silent, skeptical eye. They flaunted their success hosting dinner parties and bragging about their upward mobility. But the paperwork resting on my desk told the unvarnished truth. They owned nothing. I opened the first ledger. The luxury downtown condo they lived in, the one Vanessa constantly flaunted on social media, was entirely owned by my private LLC. I allowed them to live there rent-free, assuming I was providing a secure foundation for my grandson to grow up in. I opened the second ledger. The pristine imported SUV Vanessa drove to yoga every morning was leased directly under my name, the payments auto-drafting from my secondary checking account on the first of every month. I opened the third ledger. I pulled up the most recent digital statements for my accounts. There it was. The Platinum credit card, the very card currently sitting in Vanessa's designer wallet. The card securing their 2-week stay at an exclusive Maui resort was an authorized user card linked directly to my primary wealth management account. They had treated me like a limitless silent bank. They assumed my love for my son would guarantee an endless flow of capital regardless of their behavior. They believed they could discard my grandson at an airport, text me to handle their mess, and proceed to enjoy a $25,000 vacation on my dime without consequence. They were profoundly mistaken. The shock of the betrayal faded entirely, replaced by the precise, calculating mind of a logistics executive who had spent 40 years dismantling corporate rivals. I sat at my desk, my hand hovering over the telephone. The time for silent subsidies had ended. The architecture of their ruin was already laid out in the ledgers before me, and I was about to systematically dismantle every single pillar of their fake, luxurious life. The glow of the computer monitor cast a harsh, pale light across the mahogany desk. Lawrence sat perfectly still, watching the digital lines of his credit card statement update in real time. Down the hall, his 8-year-old grandson slept soundly, under a heavy quilt, finally exhausted from the terror of being abandoned at the airport. In the quiet of the estate, Lawrence felt no exhaustion at all. He felt a profound, chilling clarity. His decades in corporate logistics had trained him for exactly this kind of crisis. When a supply chain became corrupted, you did not argue with it. You did not negotiate with a failing system. You isolated the compromised node and you severed its lifeline. On the screen, a new pending transaction flickered into existence. It was a charge for premium in-flight wireless internet. A moment later, another charge appeared for onboard champagne. Cameron and Vanessa were 30,000 feet in the air, drinking vintage wine on his dime, completely unbothered by the child they had discarded at the security checkpoint. Lawrence watched the numbers climb. He felt the cold iron of consequence settling into his bones. They believed they had won. They believed his money was their birthright, and his silence was their shield. Lawrence picked up his phone. He did not dial his son. He dialed the private concierge number listed on the back of his heavy metal credit card. The line rang barely once before a crisp, professional voice answered. The representative greeted him by name, acknowledging his status as a priority wealth management client. She asked how she could assist him this evening. Lawrence spoke in a measured, low tone. He explained that his account had been compromised. He stated clearly that his authorized user card, currently in the possession of his son, was being used in a manner that required immediate and highly specific security interventions. The representative immediately offered to cancel the card and issue a replacement. Lawrence stopped her. A simple cancellation was too easy. A simple cancellation meant Cameron's card would be declined at the rental car counter the moment they landed in Maui. They would simply turn around, sleep in the airport, and fly back home the next morning. That was a minor inconvenience. Lawrence did not want to inconvenience them. He wanted to dismantle their entire reality. He gave the representative a precise set of instructions. He told her he needed the card to remain active for exactly one more major transaction. He knew their itinerary. He knew they were booked at an exclusive luxury resort on the coast of Maui, a place that demanded a $2,000 a night deposit just to hand over the room keys. "Let the hotel deposit clear," Lawrence instructed the concierge. The woman on the line sounded confused, but respectfully agreed to follow his directive. Lawrence explained the mechanics of his trap with the cold precision of a military tactician. He wanted Cameron and Vanessa to arrive at the resort. He wanted them to walk into the grand lobby with their luggage. He wanted them to hand over the platinum card and watch the hotel clerk smile as the initial authorization was approved. He wanted them to take the elevator up to their lavish oceanfront suite, unpack their bags, and believe they had successfully gotten away with their cruelty. "Once that initial hotel deposit clears," Lawrence said, his voice hard and unyielding, "I want a complete geographical lock placed on the account. You are to flag any subsequent transactions originating from the state of Hawaii as fraudulent. I suspect the card is in the hands of unauthorized individuals. Do you understand?" The representative confirmed the instructions. She repeated the parameters back to him to ensure absolute accuracy. The initial resort deposit would be approved. The moment that transaction posted the account would trigger an automatic fraud freeze for any local island purchases. Any attempt to buy dinner order room service, book a cabana, or pay for a return flight would be met with a hard decline. Lawrence was not finished. He knew Cameron. His son was weak, but he was also manipulative. The moment the card started declining, Cameron would call the customer service line. He would use his status as an authorized user to attempt to lift the fraud freeze. He would lie, cry, and invent emergencies to regain access to the funds. "I need to establish a verbal security passcode," Lawrence told the representative. He requested that a strict lock be placed on the entire profile. If anyone called attempting to authorize charges or lift the geographical restriction, they would be required to provide a specific password. Without that password, the fraud department was instructed to refuse all assistance and terminate the call immediately. The representative asked what he would like the password to be. Lawrence looked toward the hallway where his grandson was sleeping. He thought about the small Batman backpack resting on the floor by the front door. "Make the password." "Leo," he said. The representative typed the information into the system. She assured Lawrence that the trap was set. The primary account was now heavily restricted. Cameron could check into his opulent suite, but the second he tried to buy a cup of coffee the following morning, the entire financial illusion would collapse. The concierge asked if there was anything else he required. Lawrence thanked her and ended the call. He set the phone down on the desk. The silence in the office felt entirely different now. It was no longer the silence of a victim. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the snare to snap shut. Lawrence leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He visualized the logistical nightmare he had just engineered. Tomorrow morning, they would wake up in paradise. They would walk down to the resort dining room, order a lavish breakfast, and hand the waiter the platinum card. The waiter would return with a polite, apologetic smile. The card would be declined. Cameron would brush it off as a bank error. He would try to call the concierge. He would be asked for a password he did not know. He would be locked out. Then the resort management would inevitably receive an alert that the card on file for incidentals had been flagged for fraud. They would approach Cameron in the lobby. They would demand a new form of payment for the thousands of dollars in daily resort fees. Cameron would try to use his personal debit card, but Lawrence had already planned for that contingency. Cameron's personal checking account was entirely dependent on the monthly disbursements from Lawrence's family trust. Disbursements that Lawrence had already decided to permanently freeze. They would be stranded. No access to credit. No access to cash. Surrounded by the most expensive real estate in the Pacific Ocean, with absolutely no way to survive it. They had traded a child for a luxury vacation. Lawrence was simply ensuring they experienced exactly what it felt like to be abandoned, with no resources and no way home. Lawrence looked back at the computer monitor. A new charge appeared, a $50 transaction for a luxury ride service from the Maui airport to the resort. The system allowed it. The trap was opening its jaws. He watched as the final pending authorization popped onto the screen. It was the hotel. A massive holding fee for the presidential suite. The status blinked from pending to approved. They were inside. They had taken the bait. The geographical lock was now automatically engaged. The financial supply line was officially severed. Lawrence closed the banking tab. He felt a deep, satisfying calm wash over him. The first phase of his retaliation was complete. They were isolated on an island thousands of miles away, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet had just vanished. Now it was time to ensure that when they finally managed to crawl back to Chicago, they would find that they had absolutely nothing left to return to. He reached for a fresh legal pad and grabbed his pen. The financial excision was handled. The legal excision was next. The heavy glass doors of Croft and Associates slid open, sealing the noise of downtown Chicago out in the hallway. I did not stop at the reception desk. The paralegals knew better than to intercept my stride. I walked directly into the corner office overlooking the lake and dropped 2 pieces of paper onto the center of the mahogany desk. Sylvia Croft did not look up from her laptop immediately. She finished typing a sentence, closed the screen with a soft click, and focused her dark, uncompromising eyes on the documents I had just presented. There were no pleasantries exchanged. We had navigated corporate acquisitions and vicious union disputes together for over a decade. She knew the precise frequency of my silence. The first document was the official incident report filed by airport security detailing the recovery of an unaccompanied 8-year-old minor. The second was a printed screenshot of the text message I had received in the parking garage. Sylvia picked up the police report first. Her eyes scanned the stark, bureaucratic descriptions of a terrified child found wandering near the security checkpoint. I watched the muscle in her jaw tighten. Then she picked up the printout of the text message. She read the chilling, arrogant words instructing me to collect the boy because he had been grounded from a family vacation. She set the paper down and folded her hands on the desk. "This is felony child abandonment," she stated, her voice devoid of any standard legal hedging. "This is reckless endangerment across state and federal transport lines. I need to know exactly how far you want to take this, Lawrence." I sat down in the leather chair opposite her. "I want total excision," I said. Sylvia nodded, pulling a fresh legal pad from her drawer. "We begin with the boy. I am drafting an emergency ex parte custody order the moment you leave this room. Based on the documentation from airport security and the direct admission of abandonment via text message, any family court judge in this county will grant temporary sole, physical, and legal custody to you before the courthouse closes today." The legal terminology hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Ex parte meant Cameron would not even be notified of the hearing. He had surrendered his right to a defense the moment he handed his boarding pass to the gate agent and left his firstborn child behind. I thought about the boy's late mother, a kind woman who had passed away when the child was barely old enough to form memories. I had spent the last 6 years watching Cameron slowly let his new wife erase the boy from their lives, relegating him to the shadows of her own children. I had provided the financial padding foolishly, believing that comfort would eventually breed harmony. I had financed their luxurious facade to ensure my grandson had a roof over his head, ignoring the rot festering inside its walls. Once the judge signs the emergency order, Sylvia continued, her pen gliding rapidly across the pad. Cameron's parental rights are effectively suspended. He cannot pick the boy up from school. He cannot authorize medical decisions. He cannot pull him out of your home. If he attempts to circumvent the order, it becomes a kidnapping charge. Lock it down, I told her. The boy stays with me permanently. Make the legal wall impenetrable. Consider it done, she replied, setting the pen down and leaning forward. Now let us address the collateral damage. What is the status of the residence they currently occupy? The condo was a sprawling penthouse unit overlooking the river. Cameron treated it as his personal kingdom, a testament to a success he had never actually earned. Vanessa used it as a gilded stage for her endless social media posturing. They hosted lavish dinners and played the roles of affluent socialites, completely insulated from the reality of the mortgage. I own it, I said, my voice dropping an octave. I purchased the property under my primary holding company right after the wedding. They do not hold the deed. They do not hold the mortgage. They are merely occupants living under an informal, unwritten lease heavily subsidized by my accounts. A sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of Sylvia's mouth. She reached into her lower drawer and pulled out a stack of boilerplate eviction forms. This changes the battlefield from a prolonged family dispute into a swift corporate eviction, she said. Because there is no formal lease agreement, and because they are not contributing to the property taxes or the primary mortgage, they are legally classified as month-to-month tenants at will. I watched her fill in the property address. I had bought that penthouse to give my son a secure foundation. I had poured hundreds of thousands of dollars into its renovation, installing premium security systems and custom fixtures, all under the delusion that a beautiful environment would somehow forge a beautiful family. It was a spectacular failure of judgment on my part. The home had not fostered unity. It had merely incubated Vanessa's entitlement and amplified Cameron's profound moral weakness. I am drafting a formal 3-day notice to quit, Sylvia stated, her tone sharp and precise. Under the current municipal statutes, you have the absolute authority to terminate their tenancy with 3 days' notice. We do not need a prolonged eviction process. We do not need to wait for 30 days. Draft it, I commanded. Sign it as the legal representative of the holding company. Sylvia paused, looking up from the documents. You understand the logistical reality of this, Lawrence. They are currently over 4,000 miles away. They cannot respond to a 3-day notice from the middle of the Pacific Ocean. By the time their flight lands in Chicago, their legal right to enter that property will have already expired. I looked at the printed text message resting on her desk. I remembered the sight of my grandson sitting in the sterile airport security office, his small hands gripping his backpack. They made their logistical choices this morning, I replied, my voice stripped of any lingering paternal hesitation. They chose to navigate the airport without him. Now they can navigate the consequences without me. I want the notice filed immediately. I want the process server to post it on their door within the hour. Sylvia stamped the eviction forms and slid them into a sleek black folder. The legal machinery was now fully operational. The emergency custody order would sever their control over my grandson. The eviction notice would obliterate their physical sanctuary. They had left for paradise believing they had successfully discarded a burden. They had no concept that they had just authorized the systematic demolition of their entire existence. We have a minor tactical vulnerability, Sylvia noted, tapping her pen against the desk. The 3-day notice gives us the legal high ground to terminate their residency, but they still have physical possessions inside the unit. If they return and find themselves locked out without access to their personal effects, they could attempt to leverage a wrongful eviction suit. It would be a weak case, but it would create an unnecessary legal headache. I had already anticipated this variable. I had spent my entire career managing complex logistical maneuvers moving massive quantities of freight across hostile territories. Emptying a single residential penthouse was a trivial exercise. I will handle the inventory, I told her. The holding company will hire an independent bonded logistics crew this afternoon. Every item of clothing, every piece of furniture they claim ownership over, every single vanity purchase they stuffed into those closets will be professionally boxed, photographed, and relocated to a climate-controlled storage facility. I will prepay the storage unit for exactly 1 month. Sylvia nodded in approval. You give them the key to the storage unit when they land. You satisfy the legal requirement for the return of their personal property, and you completely eliminate their excuse to ever cross the threshold of your building again. Exactly, I said, standing up from the leather chair. The legal snare was set. The paperwork was moving. My son and his wife were currently thousands of feet in the air, completely isolated from the destruction of their false reality. They were drinking champagne, celebrating their childless getaway, entirely blind to the fact that their platinum credit cards were marching toward a geographical trap. Their legal rights as parents were being dissolved by a judge, and their luxury penthouse was about to be stripped bare. Sylvia handed me a copy of the eviction notice. I will call you the second the judge signs the emergency custody order, she said. Get the boy settled. Let me handle the courts. I took the document and walked out of the corner office. I stepped back into the elevator, the heavy doors sliding shut, descending toward the city streets. I pulled my phone from my pocket and dialed the number for a private commercial locksmith. The legal foundation of their ruin had been perfectly poured. Now I needed to change the locks and erase every physical trace of their existence from my property before the Hawaiian sun even had a chance to set. Morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds of the estate. Leo sat at the island counter eating a bowl of cereal in complete silence. He was safe, but the shadow of the airport terminal still lingered in his eyes. I poured a cup of black coffee and opened my tablet. I did not need to search hard to find what I was looking for. Vanessa treated social media as a weapon, and I knew she would not be able to resist firing it. There it was, a pristine, high-resolution photograph posted exactly an hour ago. She was reclining in a private cabana on the coast of Maui, holding a crystal flute of mimosa. Her 2 biological children were smiling brightly beside her, wearing matching designer swimsuits. Cameron was barely visible in the background, looking down at his phone. The caption beneath the photo was a masterclass in callous arrogance. It read, "Living our best life, good vibes only." She had abandoned an 8-year-old child with strangers less than 48 hours prior, and she was broadcasting her hollow triumph to the world. A sudden, sharp wave of fury threatened to break my composure, but I forced it down. In logistics, anger is a severe liability. Evidence is currency. I took a digital screenshot of the post, saving the timestamp and the geographical location tagged at the luxury resort. This photograph was not just an insult. It was an ironclad legal alibi. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that they were thousands of miles away from their primary residence. It legally shielded my next maneuver from any claim of unlawful eviction while occupied. I closed the tablet and finished my coffee. The trap in the Pacific was silently waiting to spring, but the ground in Chicago needed to be cleared before they even knew they were falling. I left Leo under the watchful eye of my trusted housekeeper and drove downtown. The morning traffic along the lakefront was a blur. I pulled into the private underground garage of the luxury high-rise building. The property manager met me in the lobby with a nervous nod. I handed him the legal notice to quit drafted by Sylvia Croft, proving my holding company held absolute jurisdiction over the penthouse unit. He stepped aside without a single word of protest. A commercial locksmith was already waiting by the elevators, holding a heavy canvas bag of tools. We rode up to the top floor in complete silence. We walked down the carpeted hallway and stood before the double oak doors of the penthouse. I told the locksmith to proceed. He did not ask questions. He pulled a heavy drill from his bag and pressed it directly into the center of the brass deadbolt. The sharp whine of the drill bit biting into metal echoed through the empty corridor. It was the sound of a parasite being forcefully detached from its host. Within 10 minutes, the old lock cylinders lay ruined on the floor. The locksmith installed brand-new industrial-grade mechanisms. He handed me a single silver key. The perimeter was officially secured. Cameron and Vanessa no longer possessed the ability to walk into this space. Their access was permanently revoked. The moment the locksmith stepped onto the elevator, a team of 6 bonded commercial movers stepped off. They wore matching gray uniforms and pushed heavy flatbed carts loaded with industrial cardboard boxes. I opened the newly secured doors and ushered them inside. The penthouse was a monument to unearned extravagance. Vanessa had decorated the space with money she had never worked a single day to earn. Velvet sofas, abstract sculptures, and massive imported rugs filled the sprawling rooms. I instructed the crew chief to pack absolutely everything and to leave no trace of their occupancy. The men moved with clinical efficiency. I stood in the center of the living room, orchestrating the removal of their fake reality. I watched as they entered the master bedroom and began pulling dozens of silk dresses and leather handbags from the custom walk-in closet. Vanessa treated these garments as her armor, believing the labels proved her inherent superiority. Now they were being unceremoniously folded into generic cardboard boxes. I walked into the guest room, which Cameron used as his personal sanctuary. In the corner stood a set of custom-fitted golf clubs that cost more than most people earned in a month. I had paid the invoice for those clubs. I watched a mover slide them into a heavy plastic transport bin. Every piece of electronics, every crystal decanter, every vanity mirror was dismantled, wrapped, and packed away. They emptied the kitchen cabinets and cleared the bathroom shelves. It took exactly 4 hours to strip the penthouse down to its bare drywall and hardwood floors. The echo of my own footsteps sounded hollow in the vast, empty space. The luxurious stage where they had played their arrogant roles no longer existed. I followed the moving trucks in my own vehicle as we drove to an industrial sector on the edge of the city limits. It was a bleak concrete landscape far removed from the manicured avenues they were accustomed to navigating. We pulled up to a massive windowless self-storage facility. I walked into the front office and paid for a single climate-controlled unit in cash. I prepaid the lease for exactly 30 days. The movers unloaded the boxes, stacking them floor to ceiling in the dim, narrow concrete room. All of Vanessa's designer armor and Cameron's expensive toys were compressed into a 10 by 20-foot cage behind a rolling metal door. I stood in the hallway and watched the crew chief slide the heavy latch shut. I fastened a cheap brass padlock onto the door and pulled the key from the cylinder. It was a flimsy piece of tin. It weighed almost nothing in my palm. This tiny piece of metal was now the only property they owned in the entire city of Chicago. I walked back to my car feeling the crisp air of the approaching evening. The physical excision was completely finished. My grandson was safe in my home. The legal custody orders were working their way through the court system. The penthouse was empty and secured. The physical evidence of their life was boxed up in a concrete locker. I sat in the driver's seat and looked at the clock on my dashboard. It was late afternoon in Chicago, which meant it was just approaching mid-morning in Hawaii. The tropical sun would be shining brightly over the resort. They would be waking up in their $2,000 a night suite, hungry for a lavish breakfast. They would walk down to the dining room entirely blind to the fact that their home was gone. They would smile and order expensive food. They would hand the waiter my platinum credit card, assuming the invisible safety net was still firmly in place. I put the vehicle in gear and drove away from the storage facility, perfectly content to let the machinery of consequence run its inevitable course. The morning of the third day arrived with a quiet clarity. Sunlight spilled across the hardwood floors of my estate, casting long, bright lines through the large bay windows. I stood in the kitchen holding a warm ceramic mug of black coffee. I watched the steam rise and curl into the air. Down the hall, I could hear the faint sounds of a cartoon playing on the television. Leo was awake. He was safe. He was completely unaware of the absolute destruction currently raining down upon the people who had abandoned him. I placed my mug on the granite counter. Next to it, my phone sat perfectly still. It had been completely silent for over 48 hours. Cameron and Vanessa had enjoyed 2 full days of uninterrupted luxury on the island of Maui. They had checked into their massive presidential suite. They had undoubtedly spent hours lounging by the infinity pool. They had ordered expensive cocktails and charged every single indulgence to the room number. They lived under the supreme delusion that their actions carried no weight and that my financial support was a permanent, unchanging law of nature. The phone suddenly vibrated against the stone surface. A harsh buzzing sound shattered the morning peace. The screen illuminated the dim corner of the kitchen. The caller identification displayed my son's name. I did not reach for it immediately. I let it vibrate. I let the ringtone echo off the walls. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. I wanted Cameron to wait. I wanted the panic to fester in his chest for a few more seconds. I walked out the back door and stepped onto the stone patio to ensure Leo would not hear a single word of this conversation. The morning air was sharp and cold. I pressed the green button and raised the phone to my ear. I offered a simple, flat greeting. The voice on the other end of the line was frantic. Cameron was breathing heavily. His words stumbled over each other in a high-pitched rush of pure panic. Behind his voice, I could hear the distinct background noise of a busy luxury restaurant. I heard the clinking of heavy silver cutlery against fine china. I heard the low murmur of wealthy patrons enjoying their breakfast. The contrast between the elegant atmosphere and my son's absolute desperation was sharp and immediate. Cameron demanded to know what was wrong with the bank. He said they had just finished eating a massive breakfast in the main dining room. He said the waiter had brought the leather checkbook to their table. Cameron had casually slipped the heavy metal platinum card inside, assuming the transaction would be utterly seamless. Instead, the waiter had returned 5 minutes later. The waiter had leaned down and whispered that the card was completely locked. Cameron told me the machine did not just decline the charge. He said the system returned a severe fraud alert. The restaurant manager had been called over to the table. They stood in the middle of a packed dining room surrounded by other affluent guests, while the manager politely but firmly requested an alternative form of payment. Cameron said his personal debit card was also rejected. He said Vanessa was currently sitting across from him with her face burning red, hiding behind her expensive sunglasses, and pretending to check her phone to avoid the staring eyes of the people at the next table. He ordered me to call the concierge desk immediately. He assumed this was a simple clerical error. He assumed I had missed a payment, or that the bank had flagged the travel expenses by mistake. He wanted me to fix his humiliation right that very second. He needed his father to swoop in and rescue him from the embarrassment of a declined card in a 5-star resort. I listened to the entire frantic explanation. I did not interrupt him. I stood on my patio and let him expel every ounce of his entitled frustration. I waited for him to ask about his son. I waited for him to inquire if Leo had made it back to the house safely. I waited for a single ounce of paternal concern to break through his financial panic. He did not ask about Leo. He only cared about the plastic card in his hand. He only cared about the luxury breakfast he could not afford to buy. When Cameron finally ran out of breath and demanded an answer, I let a heavy, terrifying silence stretch across the phone line. I wanted him to feel the absolute void of my sympathy. I wanted him to realize that the familiar safety net he had relied on his entire life was completely gone. I spoke in a voice so calm and level, it sounded like ice cracking over a frozen lake. I told him there was no clerical error. I told him the bank was functioning exactly as it was designed to function. Cameron stammered, asking me what I meant. He asked why the card was locked if there was no mistake. I explained the precise logic of my actions to my son. I reminded him that 3 days ago I received a telephone call from airport security. I told him that federal officers had located an 8-year-old boy wandering completely alone near a busy international checkpoint. I told Cameron that the officers informed me the child had been left behind by the people supposed to be protecting him. I let those words sink into his mind. I told Cameron that no rational, responsible father would ever abandon his own flesh and blood in such a dangerous, unpredictable environment. Therefore, I applied the only logical deduction available to me. I assumed that a terrible crime had taken place. I assumed that my son had been incapacitated, attacked, or robbed by an unknown assailant. I assumed that whoever had kidnapped my grandson must have also stolen my son's wallet and my platinum credit card. Cameron tried to interrupt me. He tried to speak over my cold explanation. He tried to say that Vanessa just wanted to teach Leo a lesson. He tried to say they thought I would just pick him up and take him out for ice cream. I ignored his pathetic excuses. I raised my voice just enough to cut through his panicked defense. I told him that because I believed my grandson had been abandoned by criminals and my financial assets had been stolen, I took immediate federal action. I contacted the executive fraud department of the bank. I reported the platinum card as stolen goods. I authorized a total and permanent security freeze on the entire account to prevent the kidnappers from using my wealth to fund their escape across the Pacific Ocean. The line went completely dead. I could hear Cameron breathing, but he had lost the ability to form words. He finally understood the architecture of the trap. He realized that the luxurious hotel room they had slept in, the expensive flight they had taken, and the breakfast they had just eaten were all secured by a card that was now flagged by a federal fraud division. Cameron whispered my name into the phone. His voice was no longer demanding. It was the small, broken sound of a man who realized he was standing over a bottomless pit. He begged me to call the bank back. He begged me to tell them it was a misunderstanding. He said the hotel manager was waiting for him. He said they had already racked up thousands of dollars in room charges and cabana fees that they had absolutely no way to cover. He said they were going to call the local police if he could not settle the breakfast bill. I felt no pity for the man on the other end of the line. I felt only the strict enforcement of consequence. He had traded the safety of my grandson for a beach chair and a glass of wine. Now he was going to experience the exact same isolation he had inflicted upon a child. I told Cameron that the fraud department takes international abandonment and stolen financial assets very seriously. I told him that once a federal fraud alert is initiated, it cannot simply be reversed with a phone call. The investigation was out of my hands. I advised him to return to his table. I advised him to look the hotel manager in the eye and explain exactly why he had zero access to capital. I told him that he and his wife were adults who made their own logistical choices. I told him they would simply have to sort out their financial ruin entirely on their own. Cameron started to cry. He pleaded with me to wire him funds. He pleaded with me to pay for a flight back to Chicago. He said Vanessa was going to lose her mind. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I did not offer a single dollar of rescue. I lowered the phone from my ear while he was still begging. I pressed the red button on the screen. The call disconnected instantly. The connection was completely severed. I stood on the patio and looked out over the sprawling green lawn of my estate. The trap in paradise had officially snapped shut. They had no money. They had no credit. They had a massive hotel bill they could never pay, and they were surrounded by an ocean they could not cross. The toxic arrogance they had worn like armor was now entirely stripped away, leaving them exposed to the brutal reality of the world. I slipped the phone back into my pocket, turned around, and walked back inside the house to help my grandson finish his morning breakfast. The warm Hawaiian breeze felt like coarse sandpaper against Cameron's suddenly clammy skin. He sat in the lavish open-air dining room of the Maui resort, staring blindly at the darkened screen of his cell phone. His father's final chilling words echoed relentlessly in his ears before the line had gone completely dead. "You will have to sort it out yourselves." The connection was permanently severed. For his entire 40-year life, that phone line had been a magical umbilical cord of endless capital. It was a reliable failsafe that automatically waved away his mistakes, covered his mounting debts, and insulated him from his total lack of ambition. Now there was only the deafening silence of a disconnected call. Vanessa sat across from him at the white linen-draped table. The sparkling turquoise waters of the Pacific Ocean stretched out infinitely behind her, painting a picture of absolute tropical perfection. She adjusted her oversized designer sunglasses and tapped her manicured fingernails impatiently against the stem of her crystal flute. The glass was half full of vintage champagne mixed with fresh orange juice. She let out a heavy, dramatic sigh and asked him what was taking so long and why his father was being so incredibly difficult about a simple bank error. She took a sip of her drink entirely unbothered. She had absolutely no idea that the foundation of their entire existence had just been vaporized. Before Cameron could even begin to formulate a lie to pacify his wife, a long dark shadow fell across their table, blocking out the morning sun. It was the resort manager. He was a tall, immaculately groomed man in a tailored pale linen suit, possessing the discreet, highly professional demeanor of someone accustomed to handling the delicate crises of the ultra-wealthy. However, his smile was painfully tight, and his eyes held no warmth. Cameron noticed with a sudden spike of nausea that the manager was flanked by two burly security guards dressed in matching black resort polos. They stood perfectly still with their hands clasped in front of them, projecting an aura of quiet intimidation. The manager leaned down, keeping his voice respectfully low, yet carrying a tone of absolute unyielding iron. He informed Cameron that there was a severe and immediate complication with the primary payment method on file. The Platinum card had not merely been declined due to a daily spending limit or a routine travel hold. The issuing bank had initiated a hard federal fraud lock. The primary account holder had explicitly reported the card as stolen property and flagged all Hawaiian transactions as unauthorized criminal activity. Because of this specific federal fraud designation, the manager explained the resort was legally obligated to retain the physical card. He extended a flat, open palm and asked Cameron to hand the plastic over immediately. Cameron sat paralyzed. His mouth opened and closed, but his throat was so dry he could not produce a single sound. Vanessa scoffed loudly, dropping her heavy silver fork onto her porcelain plate with a sharp clatter. She glared at the manager and demanded that he step away from their table immediately. She insisted in a haughty, condescending tone that her husband was an incredibly wealthy man, and that this was obviously a ridiculous administrative mistake that they would resolve after they finished their breakfast. The manager did not flinch. He did not withdraw his hand. He simply produced a thick, leather-bound folio from under his arm and placed it gently on the pristine white tablecloth. He informed them that because the initial room deposit was now actively under a major fraud investigation, the resort required immediate alternate payment for the balance already incurred. Cameron reached out with trembling fingers and opened the leather folio. The itemized list printed on the crisp hotel stationery was a devastating catalog of their unrestrained greed over the past 48 hours. There were charges for dual oceanfront hot stone massage therapies. There were exorbitant tabs from the five-star sushi restaurant located in the Grand Lobby. There were hundreds of dollars in daily fees for the private poolside cabana, the imported bottles of wine they had ordered directly to the room, and the expensive boutique resort wear Vanessa had casually purchased in the gift shop. The total balance sitting at the bottom of the page in bold black ink was $6,422. Cold sweat began to bead heavily on Cameron's forehead, stinging his eyes. He looked up at Vanessa. She was glaring at him, waiting for him to assert his dominance, to yell at the staff, and to fix the humiliating situation. Cameron swallowed hard, trying to push down the rising tide of pure panic. He reached into the back pocket of his tailored shorts and pulled out his leather wallet. He extracted his personal bank debit card and handed it to the manager, trying desperately to project a calm confidence he absolutely did not possess. In his frantic mind, Cameron calculated his survival. It was the third day of the month. His father had established a family trust years ago, and on the first of every single month, a generous automated disbursement was wired directly into Cameron's personal checking account. It was the money he used to fund the illusion of his independence. It was his monthly allowance, and it was more than enough to cover the $6,000 resort bill. He told himself he would simply pay the manager, take Vanessa back up to the presidential suite, and figure out how to grovel and beg his father for forgiveness later that afternoon. The manager produced a sleek, handheld processing terminal from his jacket pocket. He inserted Cameron's debit card into the slot. The machine beeped quietly, connecting to the global banking network. Cameron held his breath, gripping the edge of the table so hard his knuckles turned white. He watched the small digital screen display the word processing. The seconds dragged out, feeling like hours. Then a sharp, unpleasant tone buzzed from the small device. The manager looked down at the screen. His professional facade hardened into something entirely unforgiving. He withdrew the card and placed it flat on the table next to the massive bill. He informed Cameron, his voice carrying perfectly over the quiet hum of the restaurant, that the transaction had been denied due to insufficient funds. Cameron felt the blood drain completely from his face, leaving him dizzy and lightheaded. He stared at the card. It was impossible. The first of the month had just passed. The trust money had to be there. But as he stared at the piece of plastic resting on the linen cloth, the devastating reality of his father's ruthless retaliation finally clicked perfectly into place. Lawrence had not just flagged the platinum credit card. He had contacted his wealth management team. He had legally frozen the trust disbursements. He had permanently severed the automatic wire transfers. The checking account was completely empty. Cameron had absolutely nothing. The lifelong safety net was completely gone. He was a 40-year-old man with no career, no savings, and no money of his own, stranded on an island, with a wife who only tolerated him for the wealth he had just lost. Vanessa stared at the declined debit card. She slowly shifted her gaze to her husband's pale, sweating face. The arrogant, entitled smirk vanished completely from her lips. She asked him, her voice rising sharply in pitch, why his personal card was declining. She demanded to know why he was sitting there like a terrified child instead of yelling at the manager to fix the broken machine. Cameron could not look her in the eye. He looked down at his lap, his shoulders slumping in total defeat. He whispered that his father had cut them off. He confessed, staring at his trembling hands, that because she had forced him to leave his son Leo at the airport security checkpoint, his father had reported the credit card stolen and frozen all the bank accounts. He admitted in a voice filled with pathetic, broken surrender that they had absolutely no money to pay the hotel. The silence that followed his confession was the absolute suffocating quiet right before a massive bomb detonates. Vanessa's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated horror. She looked around the opulent dining room, looking at the sparkling crystal chandeliers, the endless gourmet breakfast buffet, and the wealthy patrons sipping their morning coffee. She had spent the last 2 days continuously posting photographs of this exact luxurious lifestyle to her social media accounts, bragging to everyone she knew back in Chicago about her fabulous, wealthy husband and their perfect tropical getaway. And then Vanessa erupted. It was not a quiet, dignified anger. It was a visceral, hysterical meltdown that shattered the serene, peaceful atmosphere of the entire resort. She stood up so violently that her heavy wooden chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the polished stone floor. She began screaming at the absolute top of her lungs. She shrieked that Cameron was a useless, pathetic liar. She screamed that he had promised her a life of endless luxury, and that he had sworn his father's money was his money. Her voice echoed harshly off the high ceilings, shrill and piercing. Every single patron in the dining room stopped eating. Forks hovered frozen in the air. Polite conversations died instantly. Dozens of wealthy, influential guests turned in their seats to watch the spectacle unfold. Vanessa turned her furious attention to the resort manager. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at his chest, screaming that she was a highly important VIP guest and demanding to be treated with respect. She shrieked that they were absolutely not leaving the presidential suite, that they were legally entitled to their vacation, and that the hotel was illegally trying to extort them over a simple banking error. Her face was flushed dark red, her designer sunglasses hung askew on her face, and her carefully curated, sophisticated image completely disintegrated into a display of pure, trashy entitlement. The manager did not raise his voice. He did not argue with her. He simply raised a hand and gestured to the two large security guards standing patiently behind him. The guards stepped forward immediately, their sheer physical presence and broad shoulders forcing Vanessa to take a sudden stumbling step back. The manager looked down at Cameron, his eyes completely devoid of any human sympathy. The manager stated clearly that their reservation was officially and immediately terminated. He informed them that they had exactly 1 hour to return to their suite under security escort pack all of their belongings and completely vacate the premises. He added, looking at the massive unpaid bill on the table, that if the $6,000 balance was not fully settled by the time they reached the front lobby, the resort would formally involve the local Hawaiian authorities and press criminal charges for defrauding an innkeeper. Cameron slowly stood up. His legs felt heavy and unresponsive like blocks of solid lead. He reached out to grab Vanessa's arm, attempting to gently guide her away from the staring crowd, but she violently slapped his hand away. She yelled at him not to touch her, sobbing loudly and hysterically as she fully realized the crushing depth of their sudden ruin. They were forced to make the long, agonizing walk out of the dining room. Hundreds of eyes followed their every movement. Hushed whispers and quiet laughs broke out among the tables. Several patrons blatantly pulled out their cell phones to record the humiliating public exit of the loud, arrogant couple who had been bragging so obnoxiously just moments before. They walked through the grand lobby, no longer acting like elite VIP guests, but moving like disgraced trespassers being actively escorted by uniformed security. The bright Hawaiian sun beat down through the massive glass skylights, warm and beautiful, completely mocking the total darkness that had just engulfed their lives. They had selfishly traded a child's safety for a slice of paradise, and now paradise was violently spitting them out, leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the inescapable crushing weight of their own miserable actions. The blinding Hawaiian sun beat down on the searing concrete of the resort driveway, transforming the tropical air into a suffocating blanket of humidity. Cameron stood near the edge of the valet roundabout, his tailored linen shirt clinging to his back, entirely drenched in the cold sweat of sheer panic. A few feet away, Vanessa was slumped against a stack of their hastily packed designer luggage, weeping hysterically into her hands. Two massive resort security guards stood a short distance away, their arms folded, watching them with unwavering, stony expressions to ensure they did not attempt to re-enter the grand lobby. They had been officially exiled. Cameron fumbled with his cell phone. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly dropped the device onto the pavement. He had tried calling his father 5 times since their humiliating expulsion from the dining room, but every single call had gone straight to voicemail. The silence from Chicago was absolute. He needed a lifeline. He needed someone to fix this catastrophic misunderstanding before Vanessa completely lost her mind. He scrolled past his father's contact and pressed the name of the only person who possessed the authority to untangle this financial nightmare. He dialed Sylvia Croft. For his entire adult life, Cameron had viewed his father's estate attorney as nothing more than a high-priced servant. She was the woman who processed his trust disbursements, the woman who handled the tedious paperwork for his leased vehicles, the woman he assumed would simply snap her fingers and wire emergency funds the moment he demanded them. The phone rang twice. Sylvia answered with a voice as sharp and cold as cut glass. She did not offer a greeting. She simply stated his name. Cameron did not even give her a chance to speak. He launched into a frantic, breathless monologue, the words spilling from his mouth in a desperate torrent. He told her there had been a massive banking error. He explained that his father was having some kind of irrational meltdown over a minor miscommunication at the airport and had accidentally flagged their primary credit card. He demanded that Sylvia immediately wire $50,000 from the family trust directly into his personal checking account. He insisted he needed cash to pacify the resort manager, secure a new room, and salvage his ruined vacation. He paced back and forth on the hot concrete, speaking loudly, trying to project an authority he completely lacked. He waited for Sylvia to assure him that the funds were already in transit. He waited for the familiar, comforting subservience of a paid employee. Instead, An agonizingly long silence stretched across the line. When Sylvia finally spoke, her tone was entirely devoid of sympathy. It was the clinical, detached voice of an executioner reading a sentence. She told him to lower his voice and listen very carefully because she had absolutely no intention of repeating herself. She informed him that there was no banking error. She stated that his father had personally authorized the permanent termination of all financial support. Cameron opened his mouth to argue, but Sylvia cut him off with surgical precision. She explained that the trust account he relied on for his monthly allowance had been legally frozen pending a comprehensive forensic audit. There would be no wire transfer today. There would be no wire transfer tomorrow. The financial pipeline was completely and irrevocably severed. Cameron felt his knees weaken. The oppressive heat radiating from the asphalt suddenly felt heavy enough to crush him. He gripped the phone tighter, pressing it against his ear, as if doing so might change the words she was saying. He pleaded with her. He told her she did not understand the gravity of the situation. He explained that he and Vanessa had literally been thrown out of their hotel room. He confessed that they were standing on the curb, with no money, no shelter, and no way to feed themselves. He begged her to reason with his father, swearing that leaving Leo at the airport was just a foolish mistake, a lapse in judgment that Vanessa had made in the heat of the moment. Sylvia's response was lethal. She told him that abandoning an 8-year-old child in an international transit hub was not a lapse in judgment, but a felony. She informed him that his actions had triggered a cascade of legal consequences that he was entirely unprepared to navigate. She instructed him to take the phone away from his ear and open his email inbox. Cameron's hands trembled as he pulled the phone away and activated the speakerphone. Vanessa, hearing the attorney's voice, stopped crying and scrambled up from the luggage, leaning in close to listen. Cameron tapped the mail icon on his screen. The inbox refreshed. Sitting at the very top of his messages was a formal legal dispatch from Croft and Associates. The subject line consisted of 3 devastating words: notice to quit. Sylvia's voice echoed through the tinny speaker of the phone, loud enough for both Cameron and Vanessa to hear every single syllable. She explained that as the legal representative of the holding company that owned their Chicago penthouse, she had officially served them with a 3-day eviction notice. She reminded Cameron with agonizing clarity that he had never signed a formal lease agreement and had never contributed a single dollar toward the property taxes or the mortgage. Under the law, he was nothing more than a month-to-month tenant at will, and that tenancy was now officially terminated. Vanessa gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She screamed into the phone, demanding to know how they could be evicted when all of their belongings, her designer clothes, her irreplaceable jewelry, and their entire lives were locked inside that condo. Sylvia did not even acknowledge Vanessa's outburst. She spoke directly to Cameron, her voice cutting through the hysterical shrieking like a blade. She informed him that a commercial locksmith had already breached the perimeter of the penthouse. She stated that a bonded logistics crew had spent the entire afternoon stripping the unit down to the bare drywall. She explained that every single item they claimed to own had been boxed, removed from the premises, and relocated to a low-budget self-storage facility on the industrial outskirts of the city. She told them that the keys to their storage unit were currently sitting on her desk, and that they had exactly 30 days to collect their property before the storage unit went into default and their belongings were auctioned off to the highest bidder. The reality of their absolute ruin finally slammed into Vanessa. She collapsed onto the pavement, completely heedless of her expensive sundress, shrieking and tearing at her own hair. Her luxury condo was gone. Her carefully curated life of unearned privilege had been erased in a single afternoon. She turned her tear-streaked face toward Cameron, pounding her fists against his legs, demanding that he fix it, demanding that he call his father and make the nightmare stop. Cameron could not look at his wife. He stared blindly at the palm trees swaying in the tropical breeze, feeling as though he were trapped in a slow-motion freefall. He spoke into the phone, his voice reduced to a pathetic, broken whisper. He told Sylvia that they had nothing. He confessed that they could not even afford to rent a car to drive to the airport, let alone purchase 2 last-minute commercial tickets back to Chicago. He begged her to find some scrap of mercy, asking how they were supposed to survive. Sylvia remained perfectly unmoved. She told him that his survival was no longer a matter of concern for her firm, nor was it a concern for his father. But she had one final piece of information to deliver, one last legal strike to execute before she ended the call. She instructed Cameron to check his email one more time. Cameron swiped his trembling thumb across the screen. A second email appeared in his inbox, marked with a high-priority red exclamation point. The attachment was a scanned legal document stamped by the family court of Cook County. Sylvia read the contents of the document aloud, ensuring there was absolutely no room for misinterpretation. She informed him that less than an hour ago, a family court judge had reviewed the police report from O'Hare Airport Security alongside Vanessa's text message explicitly admitting to leaving the child behind. Based on that irrefutable evidence of severe cross-state endangerment, the judge had immediately granted Lawrence full temporary ex parte custody of Leo. Cameron let out a strangled, breathless sound. The final pillar of his life had just been violently kicked away. Sylvia continued her words, driving the final nails into his coffin. She explained that an emergency hearing to make the custody arrangement permanent was scheduled for Friday morning at 9 o'clock sharp. She laid out the stark, inescapable mathematics of his situation. If Cameron did not walk through the doors of that courtroom on Friday morning, the judge would rule in Lawrence's favor by default. Lawrence would be granted permanent sole physical and legal custody of the boy, and Cameron's parental rights would be entirely dissolved. Cameron stared at this digital document on his phone, the legal terminology blurring together through his tears. He told Sylvia that it was impossible. He screamed that it was already Wednesday afternoon. He sobbed, stating that they were stranded on an island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean with zero access to funds, and there was absolutely no physical way they could secure transport across the country and make it to a Chicago courtroom by Friday morning. Sylvia paused. For the first time during the entire conversation, a faint trace of emotion bled into her voice. It was a cold, quiet satisfaction. She told Cameron that his inability to secure transport was a logistical failure entirely of his own making. She reminded him that just 2 days ago he had found the logistical means to abandon his own son in an airport terminal and fly away without looking back. Now he would have to find the logistical means to cross an ocean with absolutely nothing, or he would lose that son forever. She informed him that there would be no further communication from her office, nor from his father. She told him that his file was officially closed. Before Cameron could utter another desperate plea, Sylvia delivered a final parting message. She said that Lawrence sent his absolute best regards and hoped they enjoyed the remainder of their tropical vacation. The line clicked and went dead. The dial tone hummed steadily from the speaker of the phone, sounding like a flatline. Cameron stood frozen on the blistering concrete. He looked at the vast, shimmering expanse of the ocean surrounding the island. It was no longer a beautiful paradise. It was a massive, impassable prison wall of blue water. He looked down at his wife, who was still wailing on the ground, surrounded by useless designer luggage they could not even afford to check onto a flight. He looked at his dead phone, the screen reflecting his pale, terrified face. He had absolutely no money. He had absolutely no hotel room. He had absolutely no home waiting for him in Chicago. And if he could not perform a miracle within the next 48 hours, he would have absolutely no son. The architecture of his ruin was completely finished, and he was trapped squarely at the bottom of the rubble. The heavy glass doors of the resort lobby slid shut behind them, with a final definitive click. It was the sound of a vault locking. Cameron stood on the blistering pavement, with the straps of a heavy duffel bag digging into his sunburned shoulder. Beside him stood Vanessa, her face streaked with ruined mascara and sweat, holding the hands of her 2 young children. The valet brought their rental SUV around, but there was no polite smile this time. There was only a curt nod as the attendant handed Cameron the keys and walked quickly away. They loaded their bags into the trunk in absolute silence. The midday Hawaiian sun beat down on the black asphalt, radiating a suffocating wave of heat that felt less like weather and more like a physical assault. Cameron opened the driver's side door, and a blast of stagnant oven-hot air hit him in the face. He climbed into the leather seat. It burned through his thin linen shorts. Vanessa climbed into the passenger side, slamming the door with enough force to shake the entire chassis. The two children scrambled into the back, immediately complaining about the temperature and demanding to know why they had to leave the pool. Cameron turned the ignition. The engine roared to life, and the air conditioning slowly began to push lukewarm air through the vents. He stared at the digital dashboard display. The fuel tank was just under a quarter full. He had absolutely zero access to money to buy more gasoline. He could not keep the engine running indefinitely to keep them cool. He pulled out of the resort driveway, leaving the manicured palm trees and the sparkling ocean vistas behind. He drove blindly down the coastal highway, having no destination, no plan, and no hope. He eventually pulled into a dusty gravel parking lot near a public beach access point. He turned the engine off. The silence in the cabin was immediate and terrifying. Without the hum of the air conditioning, the temperature inside the vehicle began to rise exponentially. The tropical humidity pressed against the windows, turning the interior of the SUV into a sweltering, suffocating prison. Vanessa sat with her arms crossed tightly over her chest, staring out the windshield. The silence lasted for exactly 10 minutes before the fragile illusion of their marriage began to splinter. Her voice cut through the heavy air, sharp and loaded with venom. She demanded to know what his plan was. She asked him if he honestly expected her and her children to sleep in a rented vehicle like common vagrants. She told him that she was hungry, that her kids were thirsty, and that her head was pounding from the sheer stress of his spectacular failure. Cameron gripped the steering wheel. The leather was slick under his sweating palms. He told her in a voice stripped of all its usual confidence that he had no plan. He reminded her that his father had frozen the accounts, that the credit cards were dead, and that they were completely cut off. He said they had to wait out the night and try to beg the airline for a flight change the next morning. Vanessa uncrossed her arms and turned to face him. Her eyes were completely devoid of affection. She looked at him with pure, unadulterated disgust. She told him he was pathetic. She unleashed a torrent of vicious insults, tearing into his pride, his manhood, and his inability to provide the life he had promised her. She screamed that she had married him because he was supposed to be successful, because he came from a family with limitless resources. She yelled that she had traded her youth and her beauty for a man who could not even afford to buy his stepchildren a bottle of water. She demanded that he pick up his phone, call his father back, and beg for forgiveness like a dog if that was what it took to get them out of this hell. Cameron absorbed the barrage of insults. For the past 4 years, he had always bowed his head when she spoke to him this way. He had always apologized and scrambled to appease her demanding nature. He had always relied on his father's money to buy his way back into her good graces. But sitting in the blistering heat of the stagnant car with the sweat dripping down his spine and his stomach hollow with fear, something inside Cameron finally broke. The dam of his cowardice shattered. He turned his head and looked at the woman sitting next to him. He did not see the beautiful, sophisticated socialite he had proudly paraded around Chicago. He saw a parasite. His voice was dangerously low when he finally spoke. He told her to shut her mouth. Vanessa blinked in shock. She opened her mouth to scream at him again, but Cameron leaned across the center console, pointing a trembling finger directly in her face. The decades of his own weakness were suddenly replaced by a furious, desperate clarity. He told her that he was not the one who had ruined their lives. He reminded her with brutal precision that they had a perfectly funded luxury vacation handed to them on a silver platter. He reminded her that they had the presidential suite, the champagne, the cabanas, and an endless stream of wealth completely at their disposal. And then he told her exactly why it had all been vaporized. He yelled that none of this would have happened if she had not played her sick, cruel psychological games at the airport. He screamed that she was the one who decided to abandon an 8-year-old boy at a security checkpoint. He pointed out that Leo was his son, his own flesh and blood, and she had discarded him like a piece of garbage because she could not stand sharing the spotlight with a child who was not hers. Vanessa tried to defend herself, her voice rising in a shrill panic. She claimed Leo was being a brat. She claimed she was just trying to teach the boy a lesson about respect. She claimed Cameron had agreed with her decision. Cameron slammed his hands against the steering wheel, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the cramped cabin. He admitted his own guilt. He yelled that he was a coward for walking away from his son, for letting her dictate the terms of his family, for choosing her toxic approval over the safety of his own child. But he made it absolutely clear that she was the architect of their current misery. He told her that his father had not cut them off because of a bank error. His father had cut them off because she had proven herself to be a monster, and Cameron had proven himself to be her accomplice. The argument tore through the interior of the SUV like a hurricane. In the back seat, Vanessa's two children pressed themselves against the doors, staring at their mother and their stepfather with wide, terrified eyes. They had never seen them fight with such raw, unfiltered hatred. The screaming matched the oppressive heat of the car, suffocating and relentless. Cameron told Vanessa that her greed had blinded her. He stated that she was so obsessed with punishing a little boy that she had essentially signed her own death warrant. He laughed, a dry, hollow sound that held no humor. He told her that she had traded a lifetime of guaranteed luxury for the petty satisfaction of leaving a child crying in an airport terminal. And now he sneered they were going to spend the night sweating in a parking lot because she had finally pushed his father over the edge. Vanessa slapped him across the face. The sharp crack resounded in the hot air. She was sobbing now, not tears of regret, but tears of absolute furious defeat. She realized in that exact moment that Cameron was right. She had played her hand too far. She had assumed the old man was a bottomless ATM who would tolerate any level of disrespect as long as his son was kept happy. She had never factored in the possibility that the old man possessed a spine made of steel. Cameron did not even touch his stinging cheek. He simply looked at her, his eyes entirely dead. He told her that their marriage was over. He said it without shouting, without anger, just stating a bleak, undeniable fact. He realized that they shared absolutely nothing of value. There was no love between them, no loyalty, no mutual respect. Their entire relationship had been a simple financial transaction. He had provided the credit cards, and she had provided the illusion of a perfect life. Now the credit was gone, and the illusion was completely destroyed. Silence fell over the vehicle once again. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that offered no peace. The sun began to slowly sink toward the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the gravel parking lot. The temperature inside the car remained unbearably hot. The leather seats felt like sticky tar against their skin. The children in the back eventually stopped crying, their exhaustion overriding their fear. They curled up against the hard door panels, trying to find some semblance of comfort in the miserable conditions. Cameron sat rigidly in the driver's seat, staring at the darkening sky. He thought about his son Leo. He wondered if the boy was safe sitting in his grandfather's large, comfortable living room back in Chicago. A crushing wave of guilt threatened to drown him, but he forced himself to stay focused on the immediate misery of his surroundings. He had made his choices, and now he was paying the ultimate price. Vanessa curled her legs up onto the passenger seat, pulling her knees to her chest. She stared blankly out the passenger window, watching the distant ocean waves crashing against the shoreline. The luxury resort was just a few miles down the road, but it might as well have been on another planet. She was trapped in a metal box with a man she completely despised, facing a future entirely devoid of the wealth she craved. The blistering heat of the Hawaiian island had successfully transformed from a highly anticipated paradise into a torturous, inescapable prison. They were stranded, isolated, and entirely ruined. And as the dark night fully descended over the parking lot, the only thing left connecting them was the bitter, crushing realization of their own monumental failures. The evening sun dipped below the Hawaiian horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the dusty gravel parking lot. Inside the rented vehicle, the air was stagnant and thick with the sour smell of sweat and desperation. Cameron sat behind the steering wheel, staring at the black screen of his cell phone. His hands were trembling violently. He had spent the last 2 hours listening to his wife curse his name and complain about the suffocating heat. He had reached the absolute limit of his physical and mental endurance. He had no money and no resources and no allies left on the face of the earth. He pressed his thumb against the screen and dialed my private number. He held the phone to his ear, listening to the hollow ringing sound echo in the cramped cabin. Thousands of miles away in Chicago, the heavy mahogany clock in my study ticked with a steady, rhythmic precision. I sat in my leather armchair, watching the digital display of my phone illuminate the dark wood of my desk. I knew exactly who was calling. I had anticipated this precise moment since the trap first snapped shut on the island. I let the phone ring 4 times before I finally picked it up. I did not offer a greeting. I simply raised the device to my ear and waited in absolute silence. The sound that came through the receiver was entirely pathetic. Cameron was not speaking. He was sobbing. It was the wet, choking sound of a broken man who had finally realized the sheer magnitude of his own monumental failure. He drew in ragged, shallow breaths, struggling to force air into his lungs. He began to beg. His voice was a high-pitched, frantic whine, completely stripped of the arrogant entitlement he had worn his entire life. He told me they were sleeping in a hot car. He said the children were crying in the back seat, and his wife was completely losing her mind. He pleaded with me to make the nightmare stop. He asked me to wire just enough funds to get them a cheap motel room for the night. He promised he would pay me back every single cent if I just gave him a way out of the blistering tropical heat. I sat in my quiet study and listened to his tears. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no paternal urge to comfort him or rescue him from the brutal consequences of his own actions. I let his desperate pleas wash over me like cold water against smooth stone. When he finally ran out of breath and his sobbing devolved into quiet, miserable hiccups, I spoke. My voice was completely flat, carrying the weight of an iron vault swinging shut. I told him there would be no wire transfers. I told him there would be no motel rooms and no temporary reprieves. I reminded him that he was speaking to the man whose grandson he had casually discarded in a dangerous airport terminal. Cameron panicked. He started talking faster, his words tripping over one another in a frantic, clumsy attempt to save himself. He threw his wife directly to the wolves. He blamed the entire situation on her. He swore to me that he had wanted to stay with his son, but she had manipulated him. He claimed she was vicious and crazy, and that she had threatened to leave him if he did not get on the flight. He begged me to believe that he was just a victim of her cruel psychological games. He said he just wanted to come home. He pleaded for a flight back to Chicago. He said he would do anything I asked if I just bought him a ticket away from the island and away from the woman sitting next to him. I processed his cowardice with clinical precision. He was perfectly willing to abandon his wife in a sweltering parking lot, the exact same way he had abandoned his own son. He had zero loyalty to anyone but himself. I decided to use his absolute lack of character to secure the only thing that actually mattered in this entire ordeal. I leaned forward in my leather chair and dictated the terms of his surrender. I told Cameron I would purchase exactly 1 commercial airline ticket. I made it absolutely clear that I would not spend a single fraction of a penny on his wife. I would not pay for her transport back to the mainland. I would not pay for her children. I would not provide them with a single crumb of financial support. Their fate on that island was entirely their own problem. The ticket I was offering was for him and him alone. It would be a basic economy seat on the next available flight out of Honolulu. It would be a middle seat in the very back of the aircraft. I heard a sharp intake of breath through the receiver. Cameron was too stunned to speak. The reality of my terms crashed down upon him. He realized I was demanding that he physically leave his new family stranded thousands of miles from home with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs. I did not give him time to argue or formulate a response. I continued speaking, laying down the final and most important condition of my offer. I told him the cheap plane ticket came with an absolute non-negotiable price. I told him that if he accepted the flight, he would be legally required to surrender all paternal rights. The second, his feet touched the ground in Chicago. I informed him that my attorneys had already drafted the emergency paperwork. I demanded full physical custody of the boy. I demanded full legal custody. I explained that he would have no visitation rights, no input on medical decisions, and no presence in the child's future. I told Cameron he would walk off the plane and immediately walk into a designated law office to sign his son away forever. If he hesitated, if he tried to negotiate, if he attempted to modify a single clause of the agreement, the ticket would be instantly canceled, and he would remain in that gravel parking lot for the rest of his life. The silence that followed was heavy and thick. I could hear the faint sound of the ocean waves crashing against the distant Hawaiian shore through his phone. I could hear Cameron breathing, his chest heaving with the weight of an impossible choice. But the choice was only an illusion. We both knew he had no strength left to fight. We both knew he would sacrifice anything to escape his current physical discomfort. Before Cameron could vocalize his surrender, a sudden violent eruption of noise tore through the background of the call. His wife had been listening. She had heard every single word echoing from the small speaker of the cell phone. She realized that her husband was actively negotiating his own escape and leaving her completely behind to rot. Her voice shredded the stifling air of the vehicle. She began screaming with a feral, unrestrained fury. She shrieked that Cameron was a traitor and a coward. She cursed his name, calling him every vile, disgusting thing she could imagine. I could hear the sounds of physical struggle. I could hear her thrashing in the passenger seat, striking out at him in the confined space of the rental car. I could hear the children wailing in terror in the back seat as they watched their mother attack their stepfather. She yelled that he could not leave her there without money or food or a way to get her children home. She screamed that she would destroy him, that she would ruin whatever miserable life he had left if he dared to get on that airplane without her. The noise was deafening, but I did not react. I simply waited. I listened to the chaotic soundtrack of a fraudulent marriage completely collapsing under the weight of its own unbridled greed. She screamed until her voice cracked and went hoarse. She demanded that Cameron refuse the offer. She demanded that he force me to pay for all of them. Cameron ignored her. He was entirely numb to her rage. He had spent years terrified of her temper, but the fear of remaining stranded was infinitely stronger. He pushed her hands away and pulled the phone closer to his mouth, shielding the microphone from her endless shrieking. His voice was completely hollow when he finally answered me. It was the dead, flat sound of a man who had lost his soul. He told me he accepted the terms. He said he would sign the custody papers. He said he would take the middle seat. He begged me to just send him the boarding pass so he could start walking toward the airport. I felt a deep, cold satisfaction settle in my chest. The central conflict was entirely resolved. My grandson was permanently safe from their toxic influence. I had surgically removed the parasites from our lives, and I had forced them to orchestrate their own mutual destruction. I told Cameron the digital boarding pass would be in his email inbox within 5 minutes. I told him I expected his signature on the legal documents by 9 in the morning. I did not say goodbye. I did not wish him a safe flight. I lowered the phone and severed the connection, leaving him trapped in a sweltering car with a screaming woman he had just betrayed. I placed the phone face down on my desk. The silence in my study was beautiful and absolute. The operation was a complete success. I stood up from my chair and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen, ready to make my grandson a hot dinner and watch him smile in a house that finally belonged only to us. The oppressive heat inside the rented vehicle baked the stagnant air into a suffocating haze. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat staring blindly at the dusty windshield. Her chest heaved with shallow, panicked breaths. Her husband had just brokered his own escape, leaving her completely stranded in a gravel parking lot with absolutely nothing. He had accepted a single airline ticket from his father and agreed to sign away his son. Cameron sat beside her, staring at the dashboard with dead, empty eyes. He offered no solutions and no comfort. He was a hollow shell of a man, completely paralyzed by his impending legal ruin. Vanessa realized with a cold, sickening clarity that she was entirely on her own. If she wanted to escape the blistering heat of the island, she would have to swallow the last remaining shreds of her pride. She reached into her canvas tote bag and pulled out her cell phone. The battery was dangerously low. She opened her contacts and scrolled past the names of wealthy socialites and luxury personal shoppers. She bypassed the people she spent her days trying to impress, because none of them would ever wire her money. She stopped scrolling when she reached a name she had not called in over 3 years. It was her father. Arthur was a retired machinist living in a small aluminum-sided house in a working-class suburb of Chicago. Vanessa had systematically cut him out of her life when she married Cameron. She had decided that her father's calloused hands, worn work boots, and cheap suits did not match the sophisticated, affluent aesthetic she was desperately trying to cultivate. She had treated him like an embarrassing secret. Now he was her absolute last resort. Vanessa pressed the call button and lifted the phone to her ear. She listened to the hollow ringing sound echo in the quiet cabin of the vehicle. Her stomach churned with a toxic mixture of dread and profound humiliation. Arthur answered on the 4th ring. His voice was gravelly and tired, carrying the heavy weight of a man who had spent his entire life performing brutal physical labor. Vanessa choked on her own shame. She could not bring herself to admit the monstrous things she had done. She did not tell him about abandoning a child at an airport checkpoint. She fabricated a frantic, sterile lie. She told her father that Cameron was experiencing a massive banking error, that their accounts were frozen, and that they were stranded in Hawaii with no place to sleep. She kept her voice high and desperate, begging him for a loan. She told him she needed $8,000 to cover 4 last-minute flights back to the mainland. Arthur did not react with anger. He reacted with a heavy, devastating silence. He listened to the daughter who had ignored him for years suddenly demand a small fortune. He finally spoke, his voice low and incredibly weary. He informed Vanessa that he did not have $8,000 sitting in a checking account. He reminded her that he lived on a strict, fixed pension. The humiliation burned through Vanessa hotter than the tropical sun beating down on the roof of the car. Arthur told her he would not wire her a single dollar in cash. He stated that he would use his emergency credit card to log directly into the airline portal and purchase the flights himself. He explicitly warned her that he was buying the absolute cheapest basic economy fares available because his credit limit simply could not absorb anything else. Vanessa wept and thanked him, offering hollow promises to pay him back the moment they returned to Chicago. Arthur ended the call without saying goodbye. 10 minutes later, a confirmation email appeared on her screen. The digital boarding passes detailed a grueling itinerary with 2 long layovers. The reality of the basic economy tickets brought a new wave of absolute devastation. The cheap fares did not include checked baggage. They did not even include overhead carry-on luggage. The airline policy strictly permitted only 1 small personal item per passenger. Vanessa looked over the seat at the massive pile of expensive designer luggage crammed into the trunk of the rental vehicle. Those heavy reinforced suitcases contained tens of thousands of dollars worth of custom clothing, imported cosmetics, and luxury shoes. They were the physical manifestation of the wealthy identity she had spent years building. She looked at Cameron, demanding that he find a way to pay the exorbitant baggage fees. Cameron simply shook his head and looked away. They had no credit cards and no cash to cover the hundreds of dollars required to check the bags. They were forced to empty the luggage in the dirt parking lot. Vanessa wept openly as she stuffed a few essential items into thin canvas grocery totes. She had to abandon her silk dresses, her expensive jewelry cases, and her entire collection of designer footwear. They left the expensive suitcases sitting in the trunk of the rented vehicle, leaving a fortune in counterfeit prestige rotting in the dust. The journey through the airport terminal was a brutal, stark inversion of their arrival. There was no private car service waiting at the curb. There was no exclusive first-class lounge offering chilled champagne and warm towels. They joined the massive winding security lines, standing shoulder to shoulder with hundreds of exhausted, sunburned travelers. Vanessa kept her head down, hiding her tear-streaked face behind her large sunglasses, terrified that someone might recognize her in this disgraceful state. They walked to the boarding gate and sat in the hard plastic chairs, waiting until the very last boarding group was called. They shuffled down the narrow jet bridge, dragging their canvas bags. The air inside the commercial cabin was stale and heavy. They walked past the spacious first-class cabins where they usually sat, moving further and further down the narrow aisle, until they reached the very last row of the entire aircraft. Row 47 was a cramped, miserable space located at the absolute rear of the plane. The seats were pressed directly against the thin plastic bulkhead that separated the cabin from the rear lavatories. Because of the solid wall behind them, the seats did not recline a single inch. The legroom was practically non-existent. Vanessa shoved her two children into the window and middle seats. She took the aisle seat across from Cameron. He sat down and stared straight ahead, completely unresponsive. He was acting like a ghost, simply waiting to be delivered to his own execution. The aircraft engines roared, and the plane lifted into the sky, initiating a 14-hour physical and psychological ordeal. The proximity to the bathrooms became an immediate and relentless source of torture. Every few minutes, a passenger would walk down the aisle, bump heavily against Vanessa's shoulder, and pull the folding plastic door open. The harsh, stinging smell of blue chemical sanitizing fluid and human waste wafted over their seats in endless, sickening waves. The loud, violent vacuum flush of the toilet echoed directly behind their heads, sounding like a jet engine detonating every time the door closed. Her children began to complain almost immediately. They whined that their legs hurt and that they were hungry. Vanessa had absolutely no money to purchase the overpriced boxed snacks offered by the flight attendants. She had no tablets or expensive electronic devices to distract them. She was forced to sit in the cramped, foul-smelling space and manually parent her children while enduring their relentless whining. She looked across the aisle at the man she had married, hoping for a shred of support. Cameron remained entirely useless. He offered no comfort to the children and no solutions to his wife. He sat rigidly in his narrow seat, trapped in the horrifying reality of the custody hearing waiting for him in Chicago. The foundation of their marriage had been built entirely on the illusion of infinite wealth and total convenience. Stripped of the money, the credit cards, and the luxury, they had absolutely nothing connecting them. The fragile bond completely shattered in the miserable confines of the aircraft. Vanessa realized she was tied to a weak, pathetic man who could not even protect his own family. The hours dragged on in a state of suspended, agonizing misery. Vanessa could not close her eyes. The constant slamming of the bathroom door and the toxic smell kept her violently awake. She caught her reflection in the scratched plastic of the airplane window. Her hair was matted with nervous sweat. Her face was pale, drawn, and aged by sheer stress. The confident, arrogant socialite who had posed by the infinity pool just 2 days earlier was completely dead. In her place sat a disgraced, exhausted woman flying home to absolute ruin on her working-class father's meager credit line. The sun finally began to rise as the aircraft initiated its long descent into the Midwest. The gray, bleak skyline of Chicago came into view through the smudged glass of the small window. The 14-hour torture was finally ending, but there was no relief in the cabin. They had survived the humiliating flight, but the descent into the city was not a homecoming. It was a slow, miserable plunge directly into the consequences of their own spectacular cruelty. They had no home waiting for them and absolutely nowhere to hide. The miserable journey from the airport terminal to the downtown district was an agonizing continuation of their 14-hour ordeal. Cameron and Vanessa sat in the back of a dilapidated yellow taxicab that smelled faintly of stale tobacco and old vinyl. There was no sleek black car waiting for them at the arrival's curb. There was no uniformed driver holding a printed placard to whisk them away in climate-controlled comfort. They had been forced to stand in a massive, disorganized line at the public taxi stand, sweating in the humid Midwestern air while commercial airliners roared overhead. Vanessa sat pressed against the scratched plastic interior of the door, with her two exhausted children leaning heavily against her. Her skin was severely blistered from the tropical sun and peeling in angry red patches across her shoulders. Her expensive designer clothing was deeply wrinkled and stained from the grueling flight in the back row of the basic economy section. She stared blankly out the smeared window, watching the gray concrete landscape of the city blur past her. She did not speak to Cameron. She did not even look in his direction. The fragile transactional foundation of their marriage had completely evaporated somewhere over the Pacific Ocean, leaving nothing behind but a toxic, suffocating resentment. Cameron sat rigidly on the opposite side of the worn vinyl seat. His eyes were bloodshot and sunken deep into his skull. He felt physically ill, his stomach twisted with a relentless, sickening dread that made it entirely impossible to swallow. He was a man who had spent 40 years floating effortlessly on the surface of his father's immense wealth. He had never faced a single genuine consequence. He had never been forced to calculate the actual cost of his own survival. Now the invisible tether had been violently severed. He was plunging into a terrifying freefall, and the hard concrete of reality was rushing up to meet him. He desperately hoped that Sylvia Croft had been exaggerating the situation. He tried to convince himself that his father was simply trying to teach him a severe lesson. He prayed that once they arrived at the luxury high-rise, he would be able to walk through his own front door, take a hot shower, and figure out a way to repair the catastrophic damage he had caused. He clung to the desperate illusion that his comfortable life was still waiting for him at the top of the building. The taxi jerked to a violent halt in front of the towering glass and steel residential building. Cameron handed the driver the very last of the emergency cash his father-in-law had reluctantly provided. He stepped out onto the busy pavement and pulled their meager canvas bags from the trunk. They walked through the massive revolving glass doors and stepped into the sprawling marble lobby. The air inside was crisp and perfectly chilled, smelling faintly of the expensive white lilies arranged in massive crystal vases on the concierge desk. This was their sanctuary. This was the fortress of wealth and privilege where they had always been treated like royalty. But the atmosphere in the lobby had fundamentally shifted. The property manager stood behind the polished mahogany desk. He was a man who usually greeted Vanessa with a wide, deferential smile and rushed to hold the elevator doors for her. Today, he did not smile. He did not step out from behind the counter to assist them with their canvas bags. He simply looked down at his computer monitor, deliberately avoiding all eye contact. The uniformed bellhop stood perfectly still near the luggage carts, staring straight ahead as if they were completely invisible. The silent rejection was deafening. The entire building staff had clearly been briefed on the sudden change in their operational status. Cameron felt a fresh wave of panic rise in his throat. He lowered his head and walked quickly past the front desk, ushering his ruined family toward the private elevators. They rode up to the top floor in total, absolute silence. The subtle hum of the elevator cables was the only sound in the small mirrored box. Vanessa leaned her head against the cold brass railing and closed her eyes. The digital numbers above the door climbed higher and higher, counting down the seconds until their final devastating reality check. The heavy steel doors slid open with a soft chime. They stepped out into the quiet, thickly carpeted hallway of the penthouse level. The corridor was empty and perfectly still. Cameron walked down the hall and stopped in front of the massive double oak doors that marked the entrance to their home. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his heavy silver keyring. His hand was trembling so violently that he could hear the metal keys clinking together. He selected the familiar brass key and pushed it toward the cylinder of the deadbolt. The key stopped halfway inside the lock. Cameron pushed harder, assuming the pins were simply sticking. The jagged edges of the key scraped harshly against the internal metal of the lock, but it absolutely refused to enter. He pulled the key out and looked at it, wiping the sweat from his forehead. He shoved it back into the cylinder and tried to force it to turn. The metal groaned and resisted. The lock would not engage. The mechanism was completely foreign. It was a brand new industrial-grade lock that rendered his silver key entirely useless. Vanessa stepped forward, her sunburned face contorting into an expression of sheer, unadulterated horror. She pushed Cameron out of the way and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the oak door, pulling it backward with all of her remaining strength. The door did not yield a single fraction of an inch. It was sealed shut like a bank vault. She began to pound her open palms against the thick wood, screaming that this was her house and demanding that someone open the door. Her voice echoed loudly down the pristine hallway, shattering the quiet exclusivity of the residential floor. She realized in that terrible moment that Lawrence had actually done it. The old man had invaded their private sanctuary and physically revoked their access to the world they believed they owned. While Vanessa frantically rattled the unyielding brass handle, a shadow moved at the far end of the corridor. A tall, unremarkable man dressed in a plain gray suit stepped out from the recessed alcove near the emergency stairwell. He possessed the quiet, unassuming demeanor of a man whose entire profession consisted of delivering catastrophic news to desperate people. He walked slowly and deliberately down the patterned carpet, holding two thick manila envelopes in his hands. Cameron backed away from the locked door and watched the stranger approach. The last remaining fragments of his hope completely evaporated. He knew exactly what this man represented. The mechanical apparatus of his father's absolute vengeance was actively closing in on him. The process server stopped a few feet away from them. He did not introduce himself. He did not offer any false apologies or polite conversation. He operated with the cold, clinical precision of a surgical instrument. He turned his attention to Vanessa first. He held out one of the heavy manila envelopes and spoke her full legal name. Vanessa stopped pounding on the door. She wiped the smeared makeup from her cheeks and snatched the envelope from the man's hand. She ripped the thick paper flap open and dumped the contents directly into her palm. A single cheap tin key attached to a plastic yellow tag fell onto her hand. Beneath the key was a single sheet of printed white paper. Vanessa stared at the flimsy piece of metal. It weighed almost nothing. She unfolded the paper and read the stark black text. It was a formal notice of relocation. The document stated that the entire contents of the penthouse unit, including every piece of designer furniture, every imported rug, every silk dress, and every expensive piece of jewelry, had been forcefully excised from the premises. The notice provided the address of a low-budget, windowless self-storage facility located in a bleak industrial sector on the far edge of the city limits. The process server informed her in a perfectly flat voice that she had exactly 30 days to collect her belongings from the concrete locker before the storage facility considered the property abandoned and auctioned it off to cover the unpaid leasing fees. Vanessa let out a hollow, broken sound. The cheap tin key burned against her skin. Her entire kingdom, her curated image of ultimate superiority, and her entire false identity had been unceremoniously shoved into a dark cage behind a rolling metal door. She was completely locked out of her own life, holding nothing but a piece of cheap metal that represented the totality of her absolute degradation. She sank slowly to the floor of the hallway, pulling her two crying children against her chest, and wept with the total, unrestrained agony of a queen who had just been violently stripped of her crown. The process server did not even blink at her display of misery. He turned his cold, professional gaze toward Cameron. He extended the second manila envelope. The paper was incredibly thick and heavy, bound by a large metal clip. The front of the envelope bore the official blue seal of the Cook County Family Court System. Cameron took the envelope. His arms felt weak and numb. He did not need to open it to know what was inside. He could feel the devastating weight of the legal injunction pressing down on his hands. The process server recited the mandatory legal disclaimer. He informed Cameron that he had been officially served with a temporary ex parte custody injunction. He stated that the family court judge had reviewed the federal security logs and the submitted text messages detailing the intentional abandonment of a minor child at a major transportation hub. He explained that based on the irrefutable evidence of severe parental endangerment, full physical and legal custody of the child known as Leo, had been immediately and unilaterally transferred to the grandfather. The man in the gray suit continued his flawless recitation, delivering the final fatal blow to Cameron's existence. He stated that an emergency hearing was scheduled for Friday morning in downtown Chicago. He advised Cameron that if he failed to appear before the judge, his parental rights would be permanently dissolved by default. Cameron stood perfectly still in the sterile, quiet hallway, holding the heavy stack of legal documents. He stared blindly at the ornate pattern woven into the expensive carpet. He had absolutely no money to hire a lawyer to defend himself. He had absolutely no home to return to. He had no leverage, no power, and no remaining options. His father had executed a masterclass in total logistical destruction. Lawrence had not yelled. He had not argued. He had simply utilized the absolute power of the law and the unyielding force of his wealth to completely erase Cameron from his grandson's life. The process server finished his required statement. He turned around, walked back down the long corridor, and pressed the button for the elevator. The doors opened with a quiet chime, and he stepped inside, disappearing from their lives as quickly as he had arrived. Cameron and Vanessa were left completely alone in the silent hallway. They were standing mere inches away from the massive oak doors of the life they used to own, but an impenetrable wall of absolute legal and financial ruin stood firmly between them. They had pushed a quiet, patient man to his absolute limit, and now they were completely buried under the rubble of the silent reckoning. The wheels of the cheap, subcompact rental car crunched loudly against the pristine gravel of the long, winding driveway leading up to the estate. Cameron drove with white knuckles gripping the plastic steering wheel, while the tiny engine whined in protest against the steep incline. The massive wrought iron gates at the entrance had been left wide open, acting as a silent, deliberate invitation to face the inevitable reckoning. The late afternoon sun cast long, dark shadows across the manicured lawns, turning the sprawling green property into a quiet fortress. The stark contrast between the majestic beauty of the grounds and the bleak misery inside the vehicle was entirely suffocating. Vanessa sat in the passenger seat, completely unrecognizable from the glamorous socialite she had been just 3 days prior. Her skin was baked to an angry, painful red from the relentless tropical sun, and her unwashed hair hung in limp, greasy strands around her pale face. She wore a wrinkled linen dress that smelled of stale airplane cabin air and chemical cleaning fluid from the lavatory. The sheer exhaustion of the 14-hour economy flight had stripped away every single layer of her artificial superiority, leaving nothing but a desperate, cornered panic. She clutched a cheap canvas tote bag against her chest, mourning the loss of the thousands of dollars in designer luggage they had been forced to abandon on the island. Cameron brought the vehicle to a harsh, jerking halt right in front of the grand stone portico. He did not turn off the engine. He simply stared at the imposing structure of his childhood home, feeling the crushing weight of his absolute failure pressing down on his chest. The cold wind of the approaching Midwestern evening slipped through the cracks in the car windows, serving as a bitter reminder that their endless summer was officially dead. Vanessa did not wait for him. She threw open the passenger door and stumbled out onto the immaculate cobblestone driveway. Her bare feet slapped against the hard ground as she marched directly toward the massive double oak doors that guarded the main entrance. She did not look for a doorbell. She balled her hands into tight fists and began to pound violently against the solid, heavy wood. The dull, thudding sound echoed loudly across the quiet courtyard, shattering the serene peace of the surrounding gardens. She screamed for Lawrence to open the door, demanding that he face her, and demanding that he fix the catastrophic nightmare he had forced upon them. She pounded until the sides of her hands turned bruised and raw, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical sob. Cameron slowly dragged himself out of the driver's seat and walked up the stone steps, standing a few feet behind his wife like a hollow, defeated ghost. He watched her strike the heavy oak, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming terror of what awaited them on the other side. He had spent his entire life running away from responsibility and hiding behind the vast shadow of the wealth of his father. Now there was absolutely nowhere left to hide. The heavy brass locks clicked with a heavy metallic finality, and the massive right door swung smoothly inward. Lawrence stood perfectly still in the grand entryway, blocking the threshold like a towering wall of solid granite. He wore a simple, dark, tailored suit. His silver hair was perfectly combed, and his posture was completely relaxed, projecting an aura of absolute, unyielding authority. He did not look angry. He did not look vindictive. He simply looked at the two ruined figures standing on his porch with the cold, clinical detachment of a scientist observing a failed experiment. The warm golden light of the foyer spilled out onto the stone steps, illuminating the stark contrast between the pristine tranquility of the estate and the filthy, desperate reality of the two adults shivering in the evening air. Behind Lawrence, the grand hallway stretched deep into the heart of the house. Through the arched doorway of the main living room, a scene of pure, undisturbed happiness played out in bright, vivid colors. Leo was sitting on the center of the plush Persian rug, completely absorbed in a game of tug-of-war with a golden retriever puppy. The dog bounded around the room with boundless energy, its tail wagging frantically, as Leo laughed a loud, joyful sound that echoed warmly through the massive house. The boy was clean, rested, and entirely safe, surrounded by a mountain of new toys and the absolute security of the protection of his grandfather. He was entirely oblivious to the two pathetic figures standing out in the cold. Cameron stared at his son, feeling a sharp, agonizing blade of guilt twist deep inside his gut. He realized in that exact moment that the boy belonged here in this fortress of quiet strength, and that he had absolutely no right to ever call himself a father again. The image of the happy child burned into his mind, standing as the ultimate proof of his own monstrous negligence. Vanessa pushed herself forward, pointing a trembling, dirt-stained finger directly at the chest of Lawrence. She demanded her life back. She screamed that he had no legal right to steal her home, and that he had no right to throw her belongings into a concrete storage locker like common trash. She shrieked that her children were sitting in a hot, cheap rental car, traumatized and hungry, and that he was a cruel, vindictive old man for destroying their family. She demanded that he immediately release the funds from the trust account and restore her access to the Chicago penthouse. She ranted about her social standing, her reputation, and the absolute humiliation she had endured on the flight home, claiming she would call the police and tell them he had stolen her property. She threw every single weapon in her arsenal at the old man, hoping that pure volume and hysterical outrage would eventually force him to submit. Lawrence let her scream until her voice gave out and dissolved into a series of pathetic, ragged gasps. He did not raise his voice. He did not take a single step backward. He simply stood in the doorway and absorbed her fury like a mountain absorbing a brief, meaningless rainstorm. When she finally fell silent, breathing heavily and shivering in the cooling air, Lawrence began to speak. His voice was incredibly calm and dangerously low, carrying the absolute weight of a finalized judicial sentence. He told Vanessa that she was profoundly mistaken about the concept of ownership. He explained that she did not own a luxury penthouse. He explained that she did not own a limitless trust fund. He stated clearly that she had never owned the designer clothes, the expensive vehicles, or the curated social standing she valued above all human decency. He outlined the exact mathematics of their ruin with cold surgical precision. He told her that every single luxury she had consumed over the past 4 years had been a direct manifestation of his own hard work and his own capital. He explained that he had allowed her to reside in his property and spend his money because he believed she was providing a stable environment for his grandson. He told her that the moment she demonstrated her absolute lack of maternal care, the contract was entirely and permanently voided. Lawrence shifted his gaze to Cameron, who was staring at the ground, unable to meet the eyes of his father. Lawrence spoke slowly, ensuring that every single syllable landed with devastating impact. He told his son that the financial pipeline was completely dismantled, and the legal structures protecting the trust had been entirely rewritten. He explained that the storage unit containing their discarded belongings was the final piece of charity they would ever receive from the estate. He reminded Cameron of the emergency custody hearing scheduled for the following morning. He stated that if Cameron did not walk into that courtroom and voluntarily surrender all remaining parental rights, the legal team would seek criminal endangerment charges regarding the incident at the airport. He made it absolutely clear that there would be no negotiations and no second chances. Vanessa let out a low, agonizing wail. She fell to her knees on the hard stone porch, clutching at the hem of the trousers of Lawrence, begging him to reconsider. She promised she would be a better mother. She swore she would never speak a harsh word to Leo again. She pleaded for a second chance, weeping that she could not survive in the real world without his financial support. She offered to apologize to the boy, to attend counseling, to do absolutely anything required to regain access to the limitless wealth she had so foolishly squandered. She cried that her own children would suffer and that they had absolutely nowhere left to go. Lawrence looked down at the sobbing woman at his feet. He felt absolutely no pity and no urge to grant mercy. He stepped back, pulling his pant leg free from her desperate grasp. He delivered the final killing blow to their parasitic existence. He told her exactly how the transaction had occurred. He said, "You traded my grandson for a beach chair, Vanessa, so I traded your lifestyle for his safety." He did not wait for a response. He looked at Cameron one final time, sealing the permanent end of their relationship with a long, silent stare. He reached out and grasped the heavy brass handle of the oak door. He stepped fully inside the warm, bright foyer and smoothly pulled the door shut. The heavy locks engaged with a loud, echoing click, separating the two worlds forever. Cameron and Vanessa were left alone on the dark stone porch, surrounded by the cold Midwestern night, holding absolutely nothing but the crushing, unbearable weight of their own irreversible consequences. The heavy oak door settled into its solid frame with a deep, resonant thud. It was a sound of absolute finality. The brass deadbolts engaged one after another, sliding into their metal housings with sharp, definitive clicks. Cameron stood perfectly still on the stone porch, staring at the polished wood. The barrier was physical, but it represented an impenetrable wall between the life he had recklessly squandered and the bleak reality he was now forced to inhabit. The cool Midwestern night air swept across the sprawling estate, biting through his thin, wrinkled shirt. He shivered uncontrollably. He looked down at his empty, trembling hands. He possessed absolutely nothing. Vanessa remained on the hard stone, clutching the cheap tin key to the storage unit in her tight fist. The jagged edges of the cheap metal bit deeply into her palm, but the physical pain was entirely eclipsed by the magnitude of her absolute ruin. Her tears had completely dried up, leaving her eyes red and burning. She looked up at Cameron, expecting a final argument or a desperate plan. There was no fiery rage left inside him. There was no manic energy to fuel any more screams. The illusion of their glamorous life was dead, and the corpse of their marriage lay scattered across the pristine driveway. They were two parasites who had successfully consumed their host, only to find themselves starving in the cold. Cameron slowly turned away from the massive door and began to walk down the long, winding driveway. The gravel crunched loudly beneath his shoes. He did not ask Vanessa to follow him. He did not offer his hand to help her up from the cold stone. He did not look back at the towering fortress that used to be his home. They had entered the estate together, but they were leaving as two complete strangers, bound only by the shared trauma of their monumental greed. Vanessa slowly pushed herself to her feet, her sunburned skin pulling and throbbing with every movement. She gathered her children and followed her husband in absolute silence, trailing behind him in the dark. Tomorrow would bring family court and temporary shelters, but tonight offered only the endless, punishing darkness of a world that no longer cared if they existed. Inside the grand foyer, Lawrence rested his hand against the smooth oak of the door for a brief moment. He closed his eyes and listened to the profound silence of his home. He felt no lingering anger. He felt no agonizing regret. The heavy, suffocating burden he had carried for 4 years was completely gone. He had surgically removed a malignant tumor from his family tree. The toxic elements were permanently excised. He took a slow, deep breath, letting the clean, quiet air fill his lungs. The air conditioning hummed softly, creating a gentle, soothing rhythm in the vast space. He turned away from the entrance and walked down the long, carpeted hallway. His footsteps were steady and measured, echoing faintly against the high ceilings. The grand estate no longer felt like a solitary fortress, guarding a lonely old man. It felt warm and vibrantly alive. He paused by a large window and glanced out at the front lawn. He could barely see the faint silhouettes of Cameron and Vanessa retreating down the long driveway, disappearing into the shadows of the tall oak trees. They were simply ghosts, returning to the obscurity they had earned. Lawrence did not dwell on their departure. His mind was entirely clear and intensely focused on the present moment. He adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit and continued his path toward the back of the house. He stepped through the arched doorway and entered the main living room. The warm golden light of the lamps created a safe, inviting glow across the room. The golden retriever puppy immediately noticed his arrival, dropping a chewed rubber toy and bounding across the thick Persian rug. The dog circled his legs with clumsy, joyful energy, its tail wagging frantically. Lawrence smiled, a genuine, gentle expression that reached his tired eyes. He reached down and ruffled the soft golden fur, smoothing his hand over the warm head of the animal, before turning his attention to the center of the room. Leo was sitting cross-legged on the floor, completely surrounded by hundreds of brightly colored plastic bricks. The boy was focused and calm, entirely insulated from the brutal storm that had just concluded on the front porch. He was wearing clean, comfortable pajamas adorned with small cartoon rockets, and his face was bright with innocent concentration. He held up a partially constructed spaceship, looking at his grandfather with wide, trusting eyes. The deep anxiety that had plagued the boy on the island was entirely absent. He asked if Lawrence could help him find a specific blue piece to finish the left wing of the vessel. Lawrence lowered himself onto the soft rug, sitting comfortably beside his grandson. He ignored the stiffness in his knees and the crease in his trousers. He sifted through the massive pile of plastic bricks, feeling the smooth, hard edges of the toys beneath his fingers. He searched the pile until he found the exact square blue piece the boy needed and handed it over with a quiet nod. Leo smiled brightly and snapped the piece firmly into place, completing the wing. They worked together in comfortable, easy silence, snapping the pieces into place to build something new. The frantic chaos of airport security lines and blistering luxury resorts felt like a distant, irrelevant nightmare. The relentless current of conflict had finally reached its end. There were no more arguments to endure and no more betrayals to uncover. The massive house settled into a deep, peaceful rhythm. It was the quiet, satisfying hum of a truly protected home where a grandfather and his grandson could finally begin the rest of their lives in absolute safety. Lawrence handed Leo another small gray brick, watching the boy construct his tiny plastic world with careful precision. The long war was officially over, and the silence that filled the room was the most beautiful sound Lawrence had ever heard. True wealth is not defined by the endless accumulation of capital or the fragile illusion of social prestige, but by the courage to protect the innocent from toxic environments. Allowing entitlement to flourish unchecked inevitably destroys human character and invites parasitic relationships to drain a family dry. Establishing firm boundaries and prioritizing fundamental respect over superficial comfort builds a solid foundation for genuine peace. The most profound victory is never found in loud vengeance, but in the quiet restoration of order and the unwavering commitment to safeguarding the people who truly matter. If this story resonated with you, please share it with someone who appreciates the power of setting strong boundaries, and leave a comment below with your thoughts on the ultimate decision Lawrence made to protect his family.